I stayed silent for a long time while all of this was happening, watching as I was betrayed, but not taking a single step. I thought it was just a painful period, but I was wrong. It was much more complicated. And what I did in the end changed everything. All this time, I wasn't just waiting for revenge. I was waiting for the moment when she would understand the bitterness of her own actions. You won't believe what it led to. You don't want to miss the ending of this story. Read until the end. My life had always resembled the familiar script of an old movie. A Chicago suburb, a small two-story house, and the calm routine of working as an insurance agent. My days were filled with simple things. Coffee at 8, a commute to work, endless calls with clients, and returning home around 6. It was a routine I had embraced and even grown to love. It provided a sense of stability, something I had always longed for after a turbulent youth. Amelia, my wife, was the embodiment of beauty and elegance. Her long dark hair was always immaculate, and her green eyes could captivate anyone. She worked as a yoga instructor at a small studio nearby, and our neighbors often looked at her with envy or even concealed admiration. Amelia had a natural ability to draw attention, yet she always seemed a bit detached, as if the world itself was merely temporary for her. We didn't have children. We always said there was still time, but in truth, the topic had long been lost amid other, more mundane matters. Whether it was because I wasn't ready or because she avoided the subject, I couldn't say for sure. Our relationship seemed calm, though deep down, I felt something elusive, like a tiny pebble in my shoe, not big enough to stop me, but impossible to ignore. One evening, after a long day at work, I came home to find Amelia sitting in the living room, holding a glass of white wine. A psychology book lay on the table in front of her. She didn't even look up when I walked in. At the time, her indifference seemed like ordinary fatigue, but now I realize it was the beginning of our growing distance. That evening, I sat beside her, sharing the trivial details of my day, but her responses were short, as if she was only half listening. Amelia began disappearing more frequently in the evenings, claiming it was for work or meeting friends. I never questioned her words because I trusted her. But one day, when she said she was going to train with Lauren, I happened to see her in a cafe. She wasn't with Lauren, but with a man I didn't recognize. Her smile was the same one I had only ever seen on our wedding day. She noticed me but showed no emotion, merely nodding briefly before turning back to her companion. It was the first sign, but I ignored it. I convinced myself it was just a work meeting, that I was overthinking. I didn't want to ask her questions, fearing the answers might shatter my stability. It was easier not knowing. Our routine continued. Amelia grew increasingly distant, but I told myself it was only temporary. Her phone was always locked now, but wasn't that normal these days? Once, I noticed the scent of unfamiliar cologne on her clothes, but again, I brushed it off as something incidental. These small signs grew more frequent, but I had trained myself not to see them. Our conversations became punctuated by long pauses. Her voice remained soft, but the warmth was gone. One evening, when she returned home after yet another meeting, her eyes seemed different, colder. She walked up to me, touched my shoulder, and whispered, "I love you, Jack." But the words felt hollow. I decided to do nothing. My fear of conflict and loss kept me trapped. I knew I was betraying myself with my weakness, but I couldn't change the situation. I continued to turn a blind eye, hoping that somehow everything would fix itself. But I knew, one day, the weight of that pebble in my soul would become too much, and then everything would change. I didn't yet know how, but deep down, I sensed it was inevitable. That day would come sooner than I expected. My quiet world was starting to crack, no matter how hard I tried not to notice. My life had never been filled with grand dramas. I was accustomed to stability, routines, and familiar habits. Amelia had always been the one to bring color to my days, but recently, those colors had been fading. Her presence in our home was as real as ever, yet something had shifted. She had become colder, more distant, as if an invisible wall had risen between us. It all started with little things. The evenings she spent at work began lasting longer. Her phone was always on silent mode now, and the screen locked after just a few seconds. Her laughter while reading messages stirred an odd sense of jealousy in me, though I tried to convince myself it was nothing. One day, when she went to the bathroom, I saw a notification pop up on her phone. Looking forward to tonight. I didn't know who it was from, but I couldn't bring myself to ask. The culmination of my suspicions came during one encounter. That day, Amelia said she was going to visit her friend Lauren, but by chance, I saw her downtown. She was sitting in a cafe with a tall man in an expensive suit. Her smile was radiant, almost too much so. She looked at him in a way she hadn't looked at me in a very long time. My heart sank, but I couldn't summon the courage to approach her. I sat at a nearby table, trying to stay unnoticed. My heart was pounding, and my mind raced with 1,000 thoughts. What should I do? Confront her and cause a scene? Ask her what was going on? But I stayed frozen in place, paralyzed by fear. I was terrified of hearing the truth I already seemed to know. When she noticed me, the moment was filled with icy detachment. She wasn't startled or panicked. Her face remained calm, and she simply gave me a small nod before turning back to her companion, continuing their conversation as if I wasn't there. That moment shattered me. When I returned home that evening, Amelia was there before me. She spoke cheerfully about how she'd spent a wonderful time with Lauren, describing their conversation and lunch in vivid detail. Her voice was warm and sincere, but every word felt like a blow to my heart. At that moment, I realized our marriage was hanging by a fragile thread. Yet I stayed silent. Silence was easier than tearing apart the world we'd built. After that day at the cafe, our routine felt even emptier. Amelia remained as kind and friendly as ever, but I started noticing details I hadn't before. She stayed late at work more often, frequently mentioning extra sessions due to the high demand from clients. I had always known she was a popular instructor, but this sudden surge in work seemed contrived. Every morning, she prepared a special lunch for herself, something she'd never done before. Her phone was either carefully tucked away in her bag or always placed face down during dinner. I saw these as signs, but as always, I said nothing. One incident in particular stayed with me. It was an ordinary Friday, and I arrived home earlier than usual. I wanted to surprise her, make dinner, and spend a quiet evening together. But when I walked into the house, she wasn't there. Her bag was on the kitchen table, and her phone peeked out from it. I don't know what came over me, but I picked it up. The phone was locked, but a notification appeared on the screen. One message caught my attention. "See you at 8. Don't forget the red dress." My heart clenched. I put the phone back as if it might scream out my betrayal. That night, I barely slept. Amelia returned home late, smelling of someone else's cologne, and said she'd been meeting a friend. I simply nodded, wishing her good night. Her smile was as flawless as ever, but everything inside me screamed that it was a lie. With each passing day, we drifted further apart. Our conversations became limited to practical matters. She said she was fine, asked about my work, but there was no real interest in her questions. Her attention was always elsewhere. When she entered a room, I felt the coldness between us. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, but deep down, I no longer believed it. One evening, I decided to try talking to her. We were sitting on the couch, and I asked, "Amelia, are you happy with me?" She looked at me, slightly surprised, and answered, "Of course, Jack. Why do you ask?" Her voice sounded genuine, but her eyes avoided mine. It was a lie she didn't even try to conceal. I felt like I didn't know her anymore, yet I was still terrified of losing what little we had left. That night, I lay in bed beside her, listening to her steady breathing as she slept. My thoughts slammed against a wall of fear. I was afraid to ask directly, terrified of hearing the truth that would destroy everything. Inside me, two forces wrestled: the desire to know and the longing to remain in the illusion. At some point, I realized my fear was stronger than anything else. I decided to stay silent, pretending that nothing was happening. But deep down, I also knew something else was beginning to grow within me. A strange, persistent need for answers that would eventually overpower everything else. Every day since seeing that message had become a small trial for me. My life turned into an endless analysis of her words, gestures, and every glance. Every time Amelia picked up her phone, I watched her face. She smiled, sometimes even laughed softly, but she never said who she was talking to. One evening, when she said she was going to work out, I decided to follow her. My paranoid side urged me to find out where she was really going. I had always been against such things, spying, eavesdropping, but this wasn't the usual me. This was a man slowly losing trust in the woman he loved. Amelia left the house precisely at 7. She wasn't wearing her usual workout clothes, but a fitted black dress that accentuated her figure. She looked stunning, but the sight only deepened my pain. I got in my car and started following her. She parked near a small, cozy, but expensive restaurant. From my spot in the car, I saw her walk into the building. It took me a few minutes to gather my thoughts before going in after her. Inside the restaurant, I felt completely out of place. I rarely visited such places, let alone alone. And then I saw her. Amelia was sitting at a table by the window, opposite the same man in the suit I had seen before. They looked like a couple straight out of a movie. Her hand rested lightly on his, and she gazed at him with a tenderness I hadn't seen in her eyes for a long time. I stood hidden behind a column, watching them. At one point, the man leaned over and kissed her on the cheek. Amelia didn't pull away. Instead, she smiled and responded with some joke. My heart clenched, but my legs refused to move. I could have gone over, caused a scene, demanded explanations. But I just stood there, silent, because I wasn't ready for what might come next. When I returned home, Amelia was already there. She was sitting on the couch with a glass of wine, scrolling through something on her phone. She looked calm, even happy. "How was your day?" she asked, as though nothing had happened. I gave a brief reply, avoiding her gaze. That night, I couldn't sleep, trying to figure out what to do next. The morning after the restaurant, my thoughts were torn between maintaining peace and uncovering the truth. Amelia acted as she always did. She made breakfast, asked what I wanted for lunch, and talked about her plans for the day. But now I saw her in a different light. I decided to try talking to her. Over breakfast, between sips of coffee, I asked, "Amelia, are we happy together?" She looked at me, surprised, then smiled. "Of course, Jack. Why do you ask?" Her answer was as flawless as always. But deep down, I knew she was lying. Later that day, I met up with Nick, a friend from work. He was always straightforward and unafraid to speak the truth. When I told him about the restaurant, he sighed. "Jack, you can't ignore this. She's hiding something. You need to find out what's going on." His words made me think. Maybe it was time to stop pretending everything was fine. But I still couldn't bring myself to act. That evening, when Amelia came home, I asked her how her day had been. Without hesitation, she said she'd been with Lauren. Her voice was so convincing that, for a moment, I almost believed her. But then I remembered the man from the restaurant, and my trust in her words evaporated. A storm was raging inside me. I couldn't endure this uncertainty any longer, but I was terrified of destroying everything. One thing was clear. Something had to change soon. The night after that conversation was one of the hardest of my life. I lay in bed, listening to Amelia's steady breathing. She looked peaceful, even happy. Meanwhile, I felt something dark and unrecognizable boiling inside me. My thoughts swirled endlessly, keeping me from sleep. The next day, I decided to change tactics. If I couldn't make her tell the truth, I would find it myself. During my lunch break at work, I went online and hired a private investigator. I felt ashamed, but I justified it as a necessity. I needed to know what was happening. The investigator promised to report back with any findings within a week. Those 7 days felt like an eternity. Amelia continued living her life as if nothing was wrong. She made breakfasts, went to work, laughed at jokes on her phone. Her carefree demeanor slowly and mercilessly destroyed me. On the 5th day, I received the first call from the investigator. His voice was calm, but his words cut like ice. Your wife is frequently seen with the same man. Today, they were at a hotel on the outskirts of the city. My world stopped. I had few doubts before, but now they were gone entirely. I thanked the investigator and asked him to keep monitoring her. I still didn't know what to do with this knowledge, but I felt like I had lost something significant. That evening, I tried to keep myself composed. Amelia was cheerful, chatting about her work, but I barely listened. Her words passed through me like empty noise. I only nodded, pretending everything was fine. Inside, I was formulating a plan. The investigator continued sending me photos and reports. Amelia and the man from the restaurant had become regular visitors to hotels, cafes, and even parks where they strolled hand in hand. It disgusted me, but at the same time I couldn't look away. One day, as I was reviewing the photos, I realized I no longer wanted to be just an observer. It wasn't a moment of sudden clarity or an emotional breakdown. It was a decision that had been slowly forming inside me. I decided to act, but not harshly, not by creating a scene. I wanted to find a way to make her understand how much she was hurting me. I began meticulously planning. Every step had to be calculated, perfectly executed. I was no longer afraid of losing her because I had already lost her. Now, I wanted just one thing: to end this game on my terms. When I realized I had to act, a clear image of how it should unfold emerged in my mind. Amelia had always been someone who craved attention. She loved being admired for her beauty, talents, and charisma. That was her weak spot, and I decided to use it against her. I started to change. I stayed at work later, took more business trips, and at home, I made myself less available, spending more time absorbed in my phone or books. Amelia noticed almost immediately. "You've been so distant lately," she said one evening. "Is something wrong?" I simply shrugged. "Just a lot of work," I replied. Her eyes narrowed as if she was trying to read me. Her own game was starting to backfire. She was used to me always being there, listening, supporting her. But now, with me absent from her emotional space, she was growing uneasy. I saw her begin to change. She spent more evenings at home, tried starting conversations. One time, she even suggested we go out for dinner. But I just smiled and told her I had plans. She said nothing, but I saw the disappointment in her eyes. I was slowly regaining control. My confidence was growing, and her once solid world was starting to crumble. I knew we were now on equal footing. My plan was working. Amelia, who had always been so composed and self-assured, began to look worried. Her smile seemed forced, and her eyes constantly sought mine, as if trying to find something in me. I pretended not to notice. My indifference unsettled her in a way I had never seen before. Evening after evening, I found ways to occupy myself outside the house. I joined a gym and started taking photography classes. This wasn't a show for others. I genuinely wanted to find something for myself, something that would help me regain control over my life. And it worked. With each passing day, I felt my confidence returning. Amelia tried several times to find out what I was up to. "Why are you coming home so late?" she asked one evening when I returned from class. "I just decided to try something new," I replied indifferently, as if it were no big deal. Her surprise was obvious. She was used to me always being available, always nearby. Now, with things changing, she seemed uncertain. One day, while going through my things, I stumbled upon an old photo album from our trip to Colorado. It was from a few years ago, back when we had just gotten married. In every picture, we looked happy and carefree. Amelia was laughing in every shot, and I couldn't take my eyes off her. That album made me think, what happened to those people? How did we end up here? I placed the album somewhere visible, knowing she would see it. And sure enough, that evening, She sat beside me on the couch, holding the album in her hands. "Do you remember this moment?" she asked, pointing to a photo of us standing on a mountaintop. I nodded. "Yes, those were good times." "What happened to us, Jack?" Her voice was quiet, almost mournful. Conflicting emotions tore at me. Part of me wanted to shout the truth at her. "You betrayed me. You ruined everything." But I held back. No, it wasn't the time. My plan wasn't finished yet. "I think we both changed a little," I answered neutrally. She looked at me as if searching for something deeper in my words. That conversation left her pensive. She started spending more evenings at home, trying to share time together. But there was a wall between us. She could feel it, even if she didn't know how to tear it down. While Amelia was trying to figure out what was going on with me, I continued carefully planning the final step. I didn't want a direct confrontation or a public revelation. My revenge needed to be subtle, refined, something that would make her realize what she had lost. I decided to organize a dinner. The official reason was simple: to celebrate our anniversary. I suggested it to Amelia over breakfast, and she seemed surprised. "That's unexpected," she said. "I thought it would be good for both of us to spend some time together." I replied with a smile that I hoped looked sincere. She agreed without hesitation. She even asked if I needed help with the preparations, but I declined. "No, I'll take care of everything myself," I said. The dinner would be my stage. I paid attention to every detail, ordering her favorite dishes, buying a nice bottle of wine, and setting the table with candles. It had to look like the perfect evening. But behind this illusion, there was something more. I knew she would come to this dinner carrying her secrets. Her flawless facade had always been her greatest weapon. But this time, I intended to make her remove that mask. Not with shouting or accusations, but with just a few carefully chosen words. When the day of the dinner arrived, I felt a mix of nervousness and determination. Amelia came home a little earlier than usual. She looked stunning. A sleek red dress that highlighted her figure, soft curls cascading over her shoulders, and the familiar scent of her perfume filling the air with warmth. She looked like the woman I had once fallen in love with. "You look amazing," I said, trying to sound genuine. "Thank you," she replied, her smile seeming like an honest effort to please me. "The dinner smells wonderful." On the table were her favorite dishes: seafood pasta, a light salad with truffle dressing, and a bottle of wine we had shared during our first year of marriage. I had done everything to make this evening feel special, and Amelia seemed to notice. "This is really sweet of you," she said as we sat down. I merely nodded, pretending to be entirely absorbed in setting the table. We began talking about everyday things. She told me about her work, about a colleague trying to shift their responsibilities onto her. I listened, asked questions, but I could still feel the same wall standing between us, one she hadn't been able to break through. When we finished the main course, I decided it was time. Picking up my glass of wine, I feigned a contemplative look. Amelia noticed and leaned in closer. "What's wrong, Jack?" I looked at her and smiled, just thinking about how much things have changed. "Do you remember when we sat here after our wedding?" She nodded, her eyes warming slightly. "Yes, it was a wonderful evening. I didn't know how to cook yet, and we ordered pizza." We both laughed, but my heart was racing because I knew things were about to get harder. "Have you ever thought about what's changed between us?" I asked, looking directly at her. She paused for a moment, her face tensing slightly. "I think we've both just gotten a bit busy. You work a lot and so do I." I interrupted her, something I rarely did. "It's not just about work, Amelia. I think we've become strangers to each other." Her eyes widened in surprise, but she quickly composed herself. "Why would you think that?" That's when I played one of the cards I'd been holding on to for so long. "Because I have a feeling you haven't been entirely honest with me." Her face went pale, but she tried to put her mask back on. "What do you mean?" I didn't answer immediately. I took a sip of wine before speaking again. "For example, you've been unusually busy lately, but your explanations don't always match up with what I see." She set her glass down abruptly. "Are you spying on me?" Her voice was filled with indignation, but I could see fear in her eyes. "No," I replied calmly, "but I see more than you think." The silence that followed was heavy. Amelia looked like she didn't know what to say. Her eyes darted around the room, avoiding mine. "Jack, I don't know what you're trying to say," she finally muttered, her voice shaky. Amelia, She didn't respond, lowering her head instead. In the silence that filled the room, I felt the slow weight of victory tipping in my favor. But it was a hollow victory because this was a game where no one could truly win. The silence between us spoke louder than any words. Amelia sat there, seemingly trapped in her own struggle, trying to find a response but unable to put it into words. Her reaction struck me. She was startled, even frightened, but at the same time, she couldn't bring herself to admit her guilt outright. This wasn't just a defensive reaction, it was a mechanism she'd long relied on to avoid accountability. I didn't rush. Instead of pressing further, I chose a different strategy. Silence. I sat there calmly, as if nothing had happened. The tension only grew heavier. Amelia shifted nervously, trying to figure out how to escape the trap, but her mind couldn't find a way out. Finally, after several minutes of tense silence, she looked at me, her eyes full of confusion. "Do you want to know the truth?" she asked, her voice almost helpless. "I think I already know everything I need to know," I replied calmly, not breaking eye contact. She looked at me as though something inside her had finally snapped. A few seconds of silence passed, and then she spoke. I was seeing him," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "You must understand, it wasn't just, I don't know how it happened. It just did." Her confession didn't shock me. I already knew the truth. But the way she said it, the way she tried to justify her actions, made it all the more painful. She couldn't just admit it plainly, without excuses, without trying to soften the blow. Felt like a betrayal on every level. "And is this what you want me to forgive?" I asked, staring straight into her eyes. She blinked as if about to respond, but I could already see the answer in her eyes. She didn't know what to say. Instead, she slowly rose from her chair and began pacing the room. It was a familiar gesture, one she always turned to when she felt uncomfortable, unable to hide her emotions. "I can't make you forgive me," she said softly, standing by the window. "But I'm so sorry it turned out this way." I walked over to her and lightly touched her shoulder. It wasn't a gesture of comfort. It was a reminder, a way of showing her that I saw everything, that she couldn't simply walk away from this. I felt her body flinch under my touch, but she didn't pull away. Now that I knew the truth, she didn't seem as strong, as self-assured. "I don't want your regret, Amelia," I said, my words firm. "I want you to understand what's happened, and to realize that things will never be the same again." She turned to me, her eyes filling with tears once more. She looked broken, but not because she mourned for us. It was because she realized her usual games no longer worked. I wasn't the man she could deceive anymore. Even if I wasn't yet ready for a complete break, I was already on that path. "What do you want to do about this, Jack?" she asked, meeting my gaze again. I looked at her, and this time, my eyes were steady and resolute. "You've left me no choice, Amelia. Things will be different from now on." She probably expected something more emotional, but I refused to let my emotions control me. This time, everything would be under my terms. Revenge didn't need to be cruel or overt. It needed to be subtle, almost invisible, but deeply felt. "I understand," she said quietly. Her voice was now defenseless, her eyes dull. She likely realized it was too late to fix things. That night, we went to bed, but the closeness we once shared was gone. I knew that by morning, everything would be different. Day by day, we were drifting further apart, and I felt it hurt less and less. It was only a matter of time before we both acknowledged there was nothing left between us. The next morning, I woke up first. The silence was strange, with Amelia still asleep. For a few moments, I lay there, simply watching her, studying every detail of her face, every line I hadn't noticed before. She still looked beautiful, just as she had on the day I fell in love with her. But now it no longer mattered. Her betrayal, her lies, her attempts to avoid the truth. This was my reality now. She was no longer the person I had once loved. I quietly got out of bed, careful not to wake her. I needed time to think before taking the next step. I wasn't distressed anymore. Amelia had destroyed our relationship, and now it was up to me to take control of my life. There was no point in continuing to play by her rules. She had made her choice and I was making mine. Walking down the hallway, I entered the kitchen. The morning was quiet, ordinary. I brewed myself a cup of coffee and sat by the window. The view was familiar. It hadn't changed in months, but everything felt different. I no longer hoped for things to return to the way they had been. I was giving my life a new direction. At that moment, I realized I didn't want to be a man forced to live in a world of deception. I was determined to get out of this situation with dignity. Even though I wasn't yet ready to say everything to Amelia, I knew it was time for resolution. After breakfast, when she finally woke up, I suggested we talk. She immediately saw that I had changed. It was evident even in her reaction when she looked up at me. Just yesterday, she might have tried to manipulate the situation, to talk to me as if I were a child who understood nothing. But not today. "Let's talk," I said, sitting across from her. My face was calm and resolute. She could see I was no longer the man she thought she knew. She stayed silent, watching me. I took a deep breath. "I already know everything, Amelia. Everything I needed to know, I found out. You were seeing him, weren't you?" She nodded, but instead of apologizing, she lowered her gaze. "Yes, and I regret it, but I don't know how it happened. You mean a lot to me, but I couldn't live like that anymore." The same tired explanation again. She didn't even try to understand why I had become the way I was. If she had been honest, even with herself, perhaps she might have seen the truth. But no, she continued to wander through her own web of lies. "Do you regret it?" I asked, as if offering her one last chance to change something. "Yes, I do. A lot, Jack. I'm angry at myself." She looked up, but her eyes seemed empty. There was no genuine emotion in her voice. It wasn't true remorse. I got up from the table and walked to the window. The view of the city was calming, but there was no peace within me. I couldn't go back to the way things had been. "I understand that you regret it," I said, "but it doesn't change anything. You've already lost everything." Her face shifted, but she said nothing. She simply lowered her head, as though exhausted by the situation. I approached her and took her hand, not as a gesture of comfort, but to confirm for myself that it was truly over. I felt her tremble at my touch, but there were no more tears, no more hope. "We're not going to be together anymore," I said firmly. She didn't argue. There were no words that could justify what had happened. The moment was heavy, but I felt a strange sense of calm. She was already in the past, and even though we said no more, I had made my decision. After our conversation, the feeling of peace stayed with me. Amelia sat silently at the table, her eyes hollow, as though she was detached from reality. She seemed to understand that everything was ending, but she couldn't find the words to object or justify herself. Perhaps the realization that she had lost everything weighed on her more than my cold resolve. And I realized my heart wasn't broken anymore. All those years I had spent trying to save our relationship had led to this conclusion. It was the end, but it felt less painful and more like a release. I didn't wait for Amelia to say anything or attempt to justify her actions again. My actions spoke for me. I knew it wouldn't be easy. She would try to win me back. It was a natural response for someone afraid of losing what they once had. I wasn't naive about her manipulation, but I knew one thing for certain. I wouldn't be the Jack who let her control my emotions anymore. I grabbed a few of my things and began packing, not as if I were running away, but because I knew it was time to start a new chapter. I needed to leave the situation with dignity, and I was sure Amelia would understand that too. I had no intention of staying in this atmosphere. After some time, I returned to the room. She was still sitting there, staring out the window. Perhaps she was trying to figure out why I wasn't falling for her usual attempts to reverse the situation. I've decided to leave for a few days. I need some time, I said. Amelia slowly turned to face me. Her gaze was searching, as if she was trying to guess my intentions. Perhaps she still clung to a shred of hope for a miracle. But I knew for certain that no such miracle would come. "Where are you going?" she asked, her voice carrying a faint trace of hesitation, like a final grasp at hope. "Somewhere I can be alone. Without you. Without all of this." I looked her in the eyes, and there was no trace of the illusion that once lived there. No pity, no anger. Just the clear understanding that our relationship was over, a decision I had made long ago. She nodded silently, and I began gathering the rest of my belongings to leave the house. I no longer wanted to stay in a place that had become a prison of emotions. This home, once filled with joy and laughter, now felt hollow, and I had no intention of waiting for it to become a place of pain again. I set my suitcase by the door. Amelia finally stood up and approached me. Her face was calm, but it was the calm of someone who had lost a battle. She looked at me without speaking, and I remained silent as well. There was no need. Everything had already been said. "I know you've made your decision," she said, her voice barely audible. "But I still love you, Jack. And I understand that I can't change this." We stood facing each other, and I could see how hard it was for her to admit defeat. I knew there was still a fragment of love left in her heart, but she could no longer reclaim the connection we once shared. My cold gaze told her everything she needed to know. "Love isn't just words, Amelia. It's actions too. And you've already made your choice. You betrayed me, and I can't live with that." We didn't embrace. We didn't say goodbye in words. The door closing behind me did that for us. Afterward, I left. Time to rest and rethink. Whatever happened next, I was already certain of my decision. This was a new beginning for me. That day, I fulfilled a promise I had made to myself long ago. I let go of what remained between us. All those years of silence and endurance had merely been preparation for this moment. I was done being the one who wasted his life trying to fix what was irreparably broken. Each step toward ending our relationship had been increasingly clear and decisive. I was ready for the consequences. That evening, as we both sat in the living room, Amelia remained silent. Perhaps she thought I would waver again, that I would let her convince me once more that things could be fixed. But I knew there was no going back. I was letting her go, and her attempts to influence me only served as a reminder of how much time I had wasted searching for meaning in something that had no future. "Amelia, I don't want to play this game anymore," I said, looking at her without emotion. "You lost your chance. I did what I had to do." She looked up at me, confusion in her eyes. She tried to find the words, but there were none. I watched as her expression slowly faded. Silence filled the room. No tears, no apologies. Her quiet defiance was yet another confirmation that I had made the right choice. I felt something heavy inside me, as though I was shedding a part of myself. But it no longer mattered. Amelia wasn't the person I had seen in her for years. She wasn't my partner, wasn't the woman I had once loved. Now, all that was left between us was an empty shell, and I no longer had any desire to preserve it. "You're leaving, Amelia?" I said firmly, giving her no room for negotiation. "Right now. No explanations. It's for the best for both of us." She looked at me, her pride keeping her from saying anything. She rose from the couch and, without a word, went to her room. I heard her quickly start packing, her movements sharp and frantic, but I didn't follow her. I knew it wouldn't be an easy step for her, but it was necessary. For both of us. I stayed in the living room, still feeling a calm I hadn't known before. This was the moment I truly understood. I had won, though the price of that victory had been steep. She was lost to me, but I had grown stronger. A few minutes later, she returned, now with a bag in hand. She stood in the doorway, and I saw her eyes fill with tears, but they weren't tears of remorse or regret. They were tears of defeat, one she couldn't comprehend. She had always been too proud to acknowledge her mistakes. "Goodbye, Jack," she whispered, and without waiting for my reply, she left the house. I didn't go after her. I stood in place, keeping my gaze fixed on the door. Amelia was no longer a part of my life, and I knew it, though I felt a certain emptiness inside. Couldn't call it joy. It was simply a step toward ending something that had long since ended. I sat down in a chair, took a sip of water, and felt the emptiness seep through my soul. It was the hardest part, but also the most cleansing. Now I was ready to move on. From that moment, I decided I wouldn't look back. Even though it seemed like I had won, the hardest trials were still ahead. Now that I had left behind everything that had once been my world, I was entirely focused on the steps to come. These steps had to be precise. My revenge, while not brutal, was cunning and calculated, and I was ready for it to begin gaining momentum. Saying goodbye to Amelia left the feeling of a lifeless shadow descending on my life. I stood in the empty house, only a few hours after she had left everything behind. It felt like I was letting her go, but in reality, this step was more for me than for her. I didn't feel freedom or relief, but I understood that the greatest enemy was loneliness. I was alone, and that feeling was heavier than I could have imagined. The first few days after her departure were the hardest. I woke up every morning as before, but now she wasn't there. The early hours were hollow. There were no traces of her on the kitchen table, no lingering scent of her perfume in the air, only silence. I wandered through the house, feeling it grow emptier, as if stripped of all memories. Gradually, I realized that Amelia hadn't just left herself behind, but also the moments we had shared, the times we laughed, shared dreams. All of it had become part of a dark past, but not everything was lost. I began to understand more clearly that this period was a test for me, and now I had to make the most of it. My revenge wasn't yet complete. Now I could fully focus on the plan I had been nurturing for so long. It wouldn't be crude revenge, but rather cunning, calculated, and, above all, merciless. Over the next few days, I started rebuilding my routine, but with a new approach. I was no longer the man who ran from reality, the man everyone around me expected me to be. I decided to immerse myself in work and embrace a calmness that would have once seemed unbearably dull to me. But now it was the only right path. I began focusing on what brought me joy without dwelling on the past. I met with friends, went to the gym, and even started exploring new career opportunities. However, in each of these steps, I found something hidden. I looked for clues, connections, places where I could take the next step, where my strategy might unfold. And I knew that now, with her gone, I could act without fear. I couldn't leave her as she had left me. Her betrayal wouldn't go unanswered. She thought I had forgotten everything that had happened, that she could live her life without consequences. But revenge always works best when it's unexpected. I needed time to prepare my plan. And then, weeks later, I felt the time had come. Amelia had already tried to move on, started seeing other people, and everything seemed normal. But I knew that when you betray someone once, that act leaves a mark. I already knew how to act. My first step was simple observation. I found out who she was spending time with now, what places she frequented, and what had become of her life since she left me. She seemed happy, and I couldn't let her forget everything that had happened so easily. So I decided to make her remember. In truth, my revenge wasn't built on open confrontation. I gathered small facts, minor details that could influence her life. I knew it wouldn't be catastrophic to leave her alone, but sometimes a single nudge is enough to turn everything upside down. One day, I came across information that changed everything. I learned that her new partner, the same man she had cheated on me with, had serious financial problems. This was an opportunity. I reached out to a few people who could help me make this happen on my terms. And then I realized, my revenge didn't need huge efforts. It would be elegant, quiet, and extremely painful for her. The plan I devised was clever and carefully thought out. I didn't just want to get back at Amelia for her betrayal. I wanted to make her feel what I had gone through. All those years I watched her manipulate people, thinking she had everything under control. Now I had the chance to turn it all in her favor. This wasn't just revenge. It was going to be an event she would never forget. Something that would finally make her realize how important it is to be honest. The first step was not as difficult as I thought. I found information about her new partner, the one she had started seeing after we separated. His name was James, and he was financially unstable. All his investment connections were dubious, and his mood was prone to small scams that clearly didn't seem like a healthy lifestyle. I found some compromising documents that, I believed, could be used against him if necessary. This gave me leverage to start moving things forward. I began gathering more information about James, where he worked, what kind of friends he had, where he liked to relax. He was always so open about his life that it was easy to catch him in a few mistakes. Somewhere in his past was a dark story he had been trying to avoid, but I knew I would find the traces. It was just a matter of time. Finally, I found what I was looking for. One of his old acquaintances, who had recently revealed himself on social media, was one of those people who shares exciting stories from their past. And this man mentioned James in the context of some minor illegal activities he had been hiding to maintain his status in society. This didn't surprise me. After all, this guy had always been prone to adventure. From that moment on, I knew this was my entry point. Now, I had a significant amount of power because this compromising information could destroy James' reputation. It was simply a matter of when and how to use it. The next step was to do something else. I used a few people from my circle to learn more about Amelia's relationship with James, to get insights into her emotions and the real state of things. I knew that, even though she was with him, she still cared about me. I felt that sometimes she checked my social media, looking for any hint that I still missed her, and that was the chance. I decided to pull her back into the past. I accidentally, and totally unintentionally, arranged a meeting at a place where Amelia and I had often met before, her favorite cafe, where we used to spend evenings that seemed so carefree. I didn't tell her I would be there, but in my plan, it was the exact place where we could meet, again through my ability to manipulate circumstances. That evening, I didn't plan to do anything special. I simply sat at the table we usually chose and left a few hints for her. A few minutes later, she walked in, and I saw her gaze immediately land on me. That was the moment when all her confidence and pride started to crumble. Amelia couldn't hide that she was surprised to see me, although she tried to keep it together as always. We didn't talk about us, didn't discuss her leaving, but I noticed how her face became more nervous. I could feel it was pushing her toward a sense of guilt. "I saw you yesterday," I said, trying to remain calm, but at the same time keeping a hint of irony in my voice. "How's your new friend?" She fell silent for a moment, and I saw doubt flicker in her eyes. She sensed that something was wrong, but I didn't give her any chance to explain. My words no longer held any sympathy. I wanted her to understand what she did wasn't without consequences. I threw a piece of paper onto the table, on which were written a few lines of compromising information about James. She saw it and immediately turned pale, her hand gripping the glass so tightly that I thought she might break it. She looked at me with sadness in her eyes, but she could no longer utter a word. "Do you remember when we said that both of us should be honest?" I asked, and her gaze became like a shattered mask. "And this is what I really wanted from you, the truth. But you chose lies, and now you have to live with them." The silence between us stretched, and I could feel my revenge gaining momentum. Now she surely realized what she was dealing with. That evening, after our meeting, I went back home, but my mind was far from calm. Amelia, looking at what I had left on the table, realized this wasn't just a coincidence. I knew she had started to worry, and that was exactly what I wanted. Now that she understood that her whole life was just a chain of lies, I could watch her try to find a way out of the situation. The moment I left the cafe, I felt a peace I hadn't felt in years. I didn't plan to push her further. My words had already done their job. My goal was achieved. Now that she understood that everything she had worked for was under my control, I simply left her alone with her thoughts. That was enough. I started keeping track of her movements a few days later, just checking if she was ready to take the first step in response to my manipulation. And indeed, I saw her changing. She was no longer as firm as before, no longer as confident. Now she was more connected with people around her who helped her forget everything, but it was no longer the same. The guilt I had caught in her eyes that evening began to take deeper root. Amelia was so prone to fear that she couldn't understand how this had happened. I could feel she started to worry, and that was absolutely right. I still had all those strings I could pull, and when she didn't even suspect what I meant, I continued acting. With each new step, I tried to remain calm. This was my plan, to appear indifferent, unchanging, but in reality, I was like a shadow watching every move she made. And this fear I had provoked only heightened the situation. She tried to act as if nothing had happened, that her relationship with James was her personal life, but every glance, every word of hers betrayed her doubts. However, I started noticing that some of her habits had changed. She was becoming more nervous, less confident. And then I realized that this was the moment to end the game. She was on the verge of breaking down, and I could already feel she would understand what was happening to her. My next step was simple but very effective. I planned to make sure she couldn't avoid making a choice. Amelia, although unwilling to admit her mistakes, was already trapped. I knew that if I pushed her a little more, she would come to me on her own, even if she didn't want to. My role now wasn't to demand anything from her, but to create a situation where she would decide for herself whether she was ready to change her life. And so, a few days later, I did what seemed impossible. I sent her a letter. It was short but to the point. I wrote that I had a few more details about James that she probably didn't know, and I intended to make them public unless she decided to meet with me for negotiations. The letter wasn't a threat. It was just a fact. I didn't say it would hurt. I knew that the mere fact of it had already stirred all the emotions in her that I had hoped for. And indeed, a few hours later I got a response. It was a simple text asking me to meet. She was ready for negotiations. But now everything I had planned was gaining speed. She had to face reality, and I was ready to show her why her betrayal hadn't gone unanswered. I went to the place that Amelia and I once loved. It was a small restaurant where we often sat at the corner table, talking and laughing. But this time, I sat there alone, waiting for her. She arrived 20 minutes after I sent my message. Her face was tense. She looked exhausted, but she came, and that was important. "I know you know everything," she said, sitting across from me. I could hear her voice trying to remain controlled, but her emotions were already on the verge. "What do you want?" I stared at her without answering. I understood that now it was her turn to make a choice. Either save face and continue the game, or reveal her true self. "I just want you to know," I said after a pause, "that I have everything I need to destroy you, but I won't do that unless you accept what I'm offering." She looked at me, her face pale, and I knew that this moment would change everything. Amelia sat across from me, her hands nervously resting on the table, her gaze, which I once loved so much, now filled with fear and confusion. It was incredible. She had been so strong and stubborn when I knew her, and now, sitting before me, she looked broken. I watched her reaction and felt every movement I made was a test for her, a trial she couldn't avoid. "You can't do this," she said quietly, her voice trembling slightly, but Amelia still tried to maintain some controlled dignity. "You can't make me do something I don't want to." I smiled, trying to hide my satisfaction at her nervousness. "Amelia, you've already made this choice," I replied calmly, "and now you have to face the consequences. I didn't make you do this, you chose lies and betrayal." She fell silent, her gaze dropping down. I could see her trying to find a way out of this situation, the arguments forming in her eyes, looking for an escape. But I knew her time had run out, and she could no longer change anything. Her realization that I held all the strings was beginning to sink in. "I can't turn back time," she said quietly, and I saw her trying to hold herself together. Her lips trembled, and I understood she had already accepted this as her fate. She was ready to do what I asked, even though she didn't want to. The only question left was, how would this end? "Yes, you can't. But I can help you do this, right?" I answered, my voice firm but not aggressive. I didn't want to break her, I just demanded respect. My goal was simple: to make her realize that her actions wouldn't go without consequences. She needed to come to terms with why her betrayal had been such a grave mistake. Amelia remained silent for a while longer. I noticed how her face began to show signs of despair. This was the moment when she had to choose: compromise with her conscience or fight against the circumstances I had set for her. At this moment, I could allow her either to win or lose depending on the choice she made. "I'm willing to meet you halfway. What do you need?" Her voice now lacked the former confidence, but she no longer tried to take control of the situation. This was the step I had been waiting for. I smiled and slowly placed one of the documents I had found about James on the table. This document was the final proof of his illegal financial schemes. I was sure Amelia now understood that this compromising material could destroy her new partner's reputation, and hers as well, proving she had been part of it. "This is the result of your actions, Amelia. Now it's your decision." I placed the choice before her. "You can tell James everything that happened and apologize. Otherwise, this document will end up in the hands of his colleagues and friends. It's that simple." She looked at me, and I could see how her understanding of the situation changed with every passing second. She was trapped, and it was obvious. I wasn't forcing her to make a specific choice. I was simply giving her the opportunity to make it voluntarily. "I will tell him." Her voice sounded heavy, but she could no longer avoid the truth. "I'll tell him everything. Just please, don't publish that document." We sat in silence for a few minutes, and I watched her. She had finally realized she could no longer defend her actions. My role in her life was now complete. She had to see for herself how her mistake would change everything. "All right," I said after a short pause, "but you have to understand that this choice is your decision. I'm not asking for anything from you except the truth. You can no longer live in the illusion that everything will be fine." She lifted her head, and her eyes were no longer as firm. This was the moment when she stopped fighting reality and accepted her defeat. I knew that Amelia could never go back to the life she once had. We left the restaurant, and for a moment, she remained deep in thought. I, however, moved forward, knowing that from this point on, her path would be entirely different. She would no longer be the same woman she once was. A few days after our meeting, I didn't hear from Amelia. At first, it puzzled me a bit, but then I realized she was in the process of accepting this new world for herself. She couldn't just come and say that everything had been decided, because, in reality, nothing had been resolved. Her internal struggle had only just begun. I didn't rush to look for her. As promised, I left her alone with her thoughts. During this time, I became more and more convinced that my actions were not just about revenge, but about creating a reality where she could see who she truly was. And then, after a few days, I received her message. She wanted to meet again. This time, I no longer had any doubts about her motivations. Amelia was ready to submit to my terms, and I was ready to show her how little value everything she had once believed in actually had. We met at the same place where it all began, but the atmosphere was now impossible to compare with what it had been before. She arrived in the thin dress I had only seen her wear during special moments. It was her way of showing that she was back in the game, that she was ready to take the final step to regain control of the situation. But her eyes betrayed her again. They were no longer as confident as before. She was no longer striving for me. She was trying to escape the trap she had set for herself. "I spoke to him," she said, sitting across from me. Her voice was quiet, but I could hear a hint of relief in it. She thought she had already resolved everything. "I told him everything. He was very disappointed, but it seems this isn't the end." He wants to try again. It's his decision. I didn't answer immediately. I wondered if she really believed her words could turn everything back. I began to realize that, although I had gotten what I wanted from her, I didn't feel satisfaction. This was no longer about revenge or control. It had become something bigger. I was no longer just the man who had been betrayed and broken. I had become the one who helped her see the reality, and in that moment, she was no longer just a victim to me. She had become a part of this game. You told him everything, right? I asked calmly, though there was still some tension pulsing inside me. And now he knows who he's dealing with. She nodded, and I saw her gaze become even more sorrowful. I think he can't understand. He loves me, and I know that. But this is different. He doesn't want to understand. I didn't rush to react. Everything I wanted was now before her eyes. Amelia was now trapped not only in front of me but also in front of herself. She had made a choice that could no longer be undone. Her betrayal was no longer just about me. It was about her own beliefs and desires. But now she realized that those desires weren't worth losing everything she had. Now your path won't be as easy as you thought, I said, looking her straight in the eyes. You think everything can be turned back. But the truth is, even if James accepts you, you will no longer be who you were. Amelia was silent, and I saw her inner world beginning to crumble. She understood that returning to her old life was no longer possible. The betrayals she had committed wouldn't disappear just because she asked for forgiveness. I know what you're thinking, I continued. But now everything depends on you. How will you feel after all of this? How will you be able to look the person you betrayed in the eyes? Her face darkened, and she lowered her head. This was the moment when she could no longer hide her inner pain. She had taken a step back, but now her choice was no longer in her control. I no longer needed to control her behavior. I saw that her internal struggle had already begun, and that was enough. You can't change everything with one word, Amelia. You can't rewind time. And even if he forgives you, it won't make you clean. She didn't respond. I understood that everything had been said, and I could no longer make her see that her choice had already led to fatal consequences. She remained with her thoughts, and I felt that my part in the story was almost complete. I won't interfere in your life anymore, I said, rising from my seat. You've made your decision on your own. But remember, your conscience will always stay with you. I left her at the spot where we had met and walked away. I didn't feel any joy or anger. I only felt calm because I knew my part in the story was done. A few weeks passed after that meeting, and everything in her life seemed to return to normal. Amelia tried to find her place again next to James, as if nothing had happened. But I saw the same invisible crack in her gaze, the one that separated her from reality. She was no longer the stubborn woman I once loved. Her determination had disappeared, leaving only doubts and an incomprehensible emptiness. I could feel it in every word, every gesture she made. As for James, he had accepted her choice. He was ready to forgive. He was willing to return to her, but I knew this would not be simple forgiveness. His trust had been shattered, and his internal struggle was no less difficult than hers. And it showed in her eyes when she stood before him, justifying herself. He forgave her, but he couldn't forget. Her betrayal remained a shadow between them, even if they tried to hide it. I watched them from a distance. Amelia and James's relationship no longer had the same look as before. They both tried to rebuild their connection, but something had clearly changed. And I knew it was only a matter of time before the real truth came to light. One evening, while I was walking through the city, I met her on the street. She was walking alongside James, holding his hand, but her gaze was distant. I immediately understood. She was lost in her thoughts, while James tried to appear calm, though he no longer held her hand as he once did. It all looked unnatural, like an act they were both trying to play for outsiders. It was a game for themselves, but I knew it was one they could no longer win. That same evening, I received a call from Amelia. I wasn't surprised. She had a question, and this call was just a matter of time. She could no longer keep it inside. "Hi." Her voice was calm, but I could feel the weight in it. "We need to talk. I need to tell you something important." I didn't rush to answer, trying to understand what she wanted from me this time. This wasn't just a meeting between two people. It was something more. It was the moment when she was trying to find a way back to her old reality. But her inner struggle had already done its work. She couldn't go back. "I'm listening," I replied, preparing for what I would have to hear. But even I wasn't ready for what she would say next. "I can't live with this anymore," she said quietly, as if the weight of these words was so heavy that they had to be released all at once. "I've forgiven myself, but I can't live in the world I created around me anymore. I can't be with James anymore, even if he forgave me. It's not what I want." I felt my heart skip a beat. It was something I hadn't expected. I didn't think she would be so vulnerable, so honest. She seemed strong, but in this call, I heard her disappointment. She was confused, tangled in her own feelings, revealing everything she had tried to hide all this time. "What do you want from me?" I asked, trying to stay calm, though I felt that this was no longer about revenge or control. Now everything was much deeper. I wanted to understand why she had reached out to me and what she truly sought. "I don't know." Her voice became quiet, as if she was afraid of her own words. I can't stay in this relationship, knowing that I betrayed and lied. It hurts. I don't know what to do." This was another confirmation of what I had long subconsciously felt. Amelia was ready to run away from herself, from her own role in all of this. She could no longer find a way to be happy with herself, and that was her greatest fear. "And what do you want me to do?" I asked again, this time more seriously. I realized that she wasn't looking for an answer from me, but from her soul. And even if she came to me for help, I couldn't make her change her life. She took a deep breath before answering. "Maybe I need time. Maybe I need to do this on my own. But I can't stay in the shadow of all of this. It's too much for me. I need to start over. And I don't know if I can go back to James." These words, though full of pain, were for me the final end to this game. Amelia finally understood that she couldn't just go back. What she had done had already become part of her life, part of her story. Now she had to find her place in a new reality. I stayed silent, giving her time, and then, without waiting for a response, I simply hung up. This moment was important for her, but also for me. Now that she was walking her own path, I no longer had any relation to her. She had made her choice, and maybe it was the right one. But it was her story, and I no longer wanted to be part of this game. A few months passed after that call, and I no longer expected any news from Amelia. She had made her choice, and I considered our story finished. But, as often happens in life, what seems finished is really just a pause before a new twist. I had no intention of contacting her again. I had gotten everything I wanted. Not revenge, not satisfaction from her suffering, but simply the chance to see how her inner struggle changed her view of the world. Amelia was no longer the woman who saw her betrayals as part of the game. She had felt the full bitterness of her mistakes. And even though James had forgiven her, I knew there would never again be that connection between them that existed before. And she knew it too. However, one morning I received a letter from her. I didn't open it right away because I knew she was once again seeking something from me that she couldn't find in herself. After everything that had happened, I wasn't interested anymore. But the letter was short and to the point. "I've done it. I've let him go. I understand that it was necessary. I can't be the way I was anymore, and I don't want to hide the truth from myself anymore. You changed me, and I have to accept that. Thank you." These were her words, and they were final. She was closing this chapter of her story, acknowledging that the mistakes she had made couldn't be undone. But she also understood that in order to move forward, she had to accept reality and change herself. And that was my greatest victory. I was no longer just part of her revenge or mistakes. I had become her mirror, helping her see the truth. I didn't respond to her, not because it hurt or because I was too proud, There was simply no need. Amelia was no longer part of the life I had left behind. She was walking her path and I was walking mine. We were not meant for each other, and that was clear. I didn't stay with Amelia. I decided that I could no longer look at her face without the burden she had brought into our relationship. Two made a choice, and though it was painful, it was a choice for me. The relationship between us became nothing more than memories of something that could no longer be returned. Sometimes I think about Amelia. I don't regret anything that happened. All those moments, all those emotions, they were parts of her and my game. Now she was a different person, and I could no longer manipulate her life as I had before. But at the same time, I understand that all of it made sense because it allowed her to see that even in the most difficult moments, there is a way out. And that way out was within herself. My story with Amelia was over, but I knew it would be a lesson for me. And a lesson not only for her. Now I knew how important it is not to leave questions unanswered, how important it is to accept everything that happens, and to understand that at the end of every story, there is a new beginning. And perhaps, even if not everything in life can be changed, there is always a chance to make the right choice. I made my choice, and now I could leave the past behind. Now that it's all over, I realized that every moment of this story had meaning. But the real question remains. Can you believe in forgiveness when you've done everything to make someone understand the truth? What do you think about what happened? Share your thoughts in the comments. I really want to hear your perspective. Perhaps, for someone, this will only be the beginning of their own journey to understanding. I look forward to your thoughts.